Hello everyone. Okay, this is Understanding Macroeconomics Lesson 5. You might remember that the last few lessons have been on economic performance. There are 6 of them, and we're currently on international trade balances. So we're 2/3 of the way through. I found this little cartoon I thought you might like. Oh man, it's even worse than I thought, and they're all lined up to go to the Eternal Economics Seminar. That sound great? Okay, let's get started with trade. So, what about international trade balances? You probably hear in the media this term, the trade balance. The trade balance is in deficit, the trade balance is bad, or whatever. It turns out there is no such thing as the trade balance. Instead, there are 4 different accounts. The first one is the merchandise trade balance, and it only tracks physical goods. Goods that are packed in boxes and come into the United States by truck or by boat or by plane, by train somehow. Physical goods. The second account is called the balance on goods and services. It includes everything in the merchandise trade balance, and then it adds also services that are imported and exported. The third account is the current account. It includes everything that's on the balance of goods and services, but it also includes unilateral transfers, which I will talk about later. And the fourth account is really different. It's the capital account. It only tracks capital flows into the country and out. Okay, so let's begin with a fundamental question, that is, why do nations trade? Well, Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, the nations trade because of the gains from specialization. They specialize, and then of course once you specialize in something, you depend on others for the things that you're not specialized in. So we specialize in trade. Each of you, if you think about what you're doing, you're training to be highly specialized in some field. Maybe you're training in marketing or management or accounting or finance. But those skills, even though you might be very productive at it, won't feed you. They won't build your house. They won't power your car. And so you take the skills that you've learned and you trade them for the other things that you might need. Okay, so let's start with a simple flow. Imagine this is the home country here, and over here we have the foreign country. So from the home country's perspective, we would buy things from the foreign country, and we would call those things imports, and then we would pay for those things with money. At the same time, that money, foreigners would have that money, and they would use it to buy things from us, which from our perspective we would call exports. This is the basic flow of trade. So it's important to keep in mind that this money that flows out in exchange for imports is the same money that flows back in exchange for exports. Money is just kind of an oil in this trading machine. So let's try an example and maybe you'll see what I'm trying to explain. Imagine that we bought $100 or $100 million worth of imports. So $100 would flow out. Then foreigners would then have 100 Federal Reserve notes which they could use to buy things from us. So they would come back this way, right? $100 million from things that they bought from us. Now to keep this example simple, let's just imagine that we bought merchandise from them and they bought merchandise from us. So $100 flowed out, $100 flowed back. So the merchandise trade balance in this simple example would be 0. Okay, now let's change it just a little bit, and so instead of let's see, we buy $100 worth of stuff from them, that's our imports, but now instead of them buying $100 worth of stuff from us, they only buy 80. So $100 went out, only $80 came back, so the merchandise trade balance would now be minus 20. The formula for the merchandise trade balance is exports, which is 80, minus imports, which was 100. So 80 minus 100 would be minus 20. So this is as far as most people go, but if you just take a minute and think about this, you'll see that this is not sustainable, what has happened. Think about it like this. That $100 flowed out, right? But only 80 came back. What happened to the other 20? They can't eat it. They can't wear it. It won't drive their automobiles. It's really only, if you think about it, it's just photos of long-dead American presidents. It only has value to them in the sense of things it can buy in the United States. So the way this is drawn can't be right. So what actually happens is some of the money is diverted. So foreigners get 100 from us, 80 of it comes back in exchange for our merchandise, but maybe the balance, the other 20, comes back in exchange for services. Services aren't counted in the merchandise trade balance, so the merchandise trade balance is minus 20, and I'm going to move it over here because I need the space. But now the balance on goods and services would be 0. Can you see that? Because 100 went out, 80 came back this way, and 20 came back this way. And so in the balance on goods and services, we're counting merchandise and services. All right, let's do it again. Let's see. This time, let's imagine that only $70 comes back from merchandise. So 100 goes out, 70 comes back from merchandise. So that makes the merchandise trade balance minus 30. And now the balance on goods and services will be minus 10. Can you see that? 100 went out, 70 came back this way, and 20 came back this way. 70 plus 20 is only 90. So the balance on goods and services is minus 10. Again, this isn't sustainable because 100 went out and only 90 came back. What happened to the other 10? It had to go somewhere. There is not, a lot of students, especially at the undergraduate level, imagine there's some kind of magic black box in some bank in a foreign country, and you just put $1 in there and somehow it transforms it into a euro or a Canadian dollar or a Mexican peso or something. There is no magic box. The money flows in and out by supply and demand just like everything else does. Okay, so the way we have this is it's unsustainable. 100 goes out, but only 90 comes back. Again, what happened to the other 10? Well, it must have come back some other way. And what happens is the 10 comes back in exchange for investments. So it's possible that a foreigner would take the $10 and buy stock or government bonds or maybe even real estate from the United States as an investment for their future. Now when they do that, the balance on goods and services is minus 10, but the capital account is plus 10. Because remember, the capital account only counts investment flows. All right, so the capital account would be plus 10. Okay. So I'm going to summarize them here in this little slide. The merchandise trade balance only counts merchandise. If you add services to the merchandise trade balance, you get the balance on goods and services. So this one, the balance on goods and services, is everything that's here plus services are added. The next one, which is the current account, adds unilateral transfers. Now, I still haven't talked about what that is. A unilateral transfer is when somebody in the United States feels called to send money to somebody in a foreign country. Maybe it's your grandma that lives in the old country where life is hard, and so you work hard and you set aside a little bit of money, and every month you send grandma a little money. That would be a unilateral transfer. Or maybe on late night TV you hear a news story about a tsunami or a hurricane or something that happens in some faraway place, or children, the Civil War and hungry children, and you feel called to send money. You're not actually buying anything. It's unilateral. It's not bilateral. You're sending money and you don't really expect anything in return. Turns out that Americans send a lot of money that way and not too much comes back toward us, and those things are called unilateral transfers. So you take the balance on goods and services, you add unilateral transfers, and you get the current account. The capital account is the only one that's really different. The capital account only counts capital funds. But because the dollars have to go someplace, it turns out that the capital account and the current account are opposites of each other. So if the current account is in deficit, say of minus 100, the capital account will be in surplus of plus 100. The only way it could be that that's not true would be if people just took the money that they made in some international trade and just threw it away. It's not likely that they do that. Okay, so let's try a simple accounting problem to see if you have it down pat. So let's say that the home country imports $850 of merchandise, and they import $400 of services, and they send out $200 of unilateral transfers to people in other countries. And let's say that the foreign country imports. Now remember, when the foreign country imports, from our perspective over here in the home country, that would be exports to us, right? So the foreign country imports $550, or put another way, we exported $550 to them, and they imported $600 of services, which means we exported $600 of services to them, and they sent $50 of unilateral transfers back to us. All right, given this information, what is the merchandise trade balance? I hope you can see that the merchandise trade balance is what we exported minus what we imported. So we exported $550 worth of stuff, but we imported $850 worth of stuff. So $550 minus $850, the merchandise trade balance would be minus $300. Now, what about the balance on goods and services? Well, remember, the balance on goods and services is everything the merchandise trade balance is. So we're just going to bring the 300 down, and now we're going to add in what's happening to services. So let's see. We exported $600 worth of services to them, but we only imported $400 of services from them. So 600 minus 400 is plus 200. Add that plus 200 to the minus 300 we got from the merchandise trade balance. We put the balance of goods and services at minus 100. Okay, now what about the current account? Remember, the current account is everything that's included in the balance on goods and services. So we're going to bring down the minus 100, and now we're going to adjust it for unilateral transfers. So let's see. We got $50 from them, but we sent out 200. So 50 minus 200 is minus 150. So adding that minus 150 to the minus 100 we already had put us at minus 250. Now, there's no information on the capital account, but we know that the capital account is a mirror reflection of the current account. So if the current account is minus 250, the capital account must be plus 250. There you go. Now let's try another one. This one is put to you in a slightly different way. In the first scenario, let's imagine that Americans buy $1 million worth of Canadian lumber. So that's an import from our perspective of $1 million from Canada. Now let's say then that the Canadians take the money and buy an equal amount, that is $1 million worth of U.S. made machinery for a new sawmill that they plan to build in Canada. So now the question is, what is the merchandise trade balance? I hope you can see that the balance is zero because we imported $1 million and we exported $1 million. See that? That's an easy one. Now I'm going to tell the same story again, but I'm just going to change it ever so slightly. Let's imagine again that Americans buy $1 million worth of stuff, or excuse me, $1 million worth of Canadian lumber. So that's an import, right? Then Canadians take the money and they buy $1 million worth of U.S. made machinery, just like they did before, for a new sawmill that they plan to build. Now they plan to build it in the United States instead of in Canada. So since they're going to build a sawmill in the United States, the $1 million in machinery doesn't leave our country. It stays in our country. So the merchandise trade balance is minus $1 million. Because remember, it only counts things that are loaded in boxes and shipped out. So $1 million worth of lumber came in and nothing went out. It's true that the Canadians bought, just as before, they bought $1 million worth of American-made machinery, but the machinery never left the United States because they built the new sawmill in the United States. So the capital account balance is now plus $1 million, right? Because Canadians have invested $1 million in the United States. It's always amazing to me how that some people think this is bad, that the merchandise trade balance could be minus $1 million, and somehow, that doesn't make us great. But this just completely, it's completely wrong. All right, so now let's test your knowledge so far. Here's a simple quiz. All right, how many trade accounts are there? Hope you can remember that there's 4. There is the merchandise trade balance, the balance on goods and services, the current account, and the capital account. All right. Some of these accounts are in deficit and others are in surplus. It depends very simply on what is counted and what is excluded, that is, what is not counted. But, all right, now here comes the hard part. That's the easy part, here comes the hard part. But what if there were a 5th account that counted everything? This 5th account doesn't exclude anything. Everything is counted. Then, would this 5th account be in surplus or deficit? So, you should stop this video for a second and think about your answer. It should be that the 5th account is always balanced. It will always be balanced if it counts everything. The only way it could be unbalanced would be if people threw money away that they made in trade. And of course, that's not likely. So this 5th account, let's call it the everything account, would be in balance all the time. All right. Now, my guess is that a lot of you are worried about how to count unilateral transfers because they are kind of tricky. We're not actually buying anything, and so it's hard to think about, is a unilateral transfer an import or an export? So I have a little slide to help you with this. So let's go back to the very, very simple slide that we had before. Now let's suppose this is you over here, and you just feel called to send some money to some needy people in a foreign country. Now, before we do that, I want you to think about something. When we imported something into the United States, which way did the money flow? The money flowed out. On the other hand, when we exported something from the United States, the money flowed in. So if you're ever confused about how to count a unilateral transfer, just ask yourself, which way is the money going? If the money flows out, it's an import. If the money flows in, it's an export. So in the case of a unilateral transfer, what happens is you send the money to the victims in the foreign country. The money flowed out. So since the money flowed out, a unilateral transfer from the United States to some other country is an import. See that? All right, how about a simple trade accounting problem? That's the wrong title. But I found this slide. It's a few years old now. It stops in 2017, so that's 4 years ago. But the Bureau of Economic Analysis prepared this slide, and this shows the current account deficit. See how it's been falling? In fact, it hasn't actually been balanced since about the early 80s, and it's been in deficit ever since. But now this is the capital account surplus. Look at it. It's like a mirror image. The capital account surplus and the current account deficit are mirror images of each other. All right? So, why is trade so divisive? You might be surprised to know that economists almost unanimously are in favor of free trade. You know, economics is a social science, and if you got a room full of social scientists, not just economists, but if you got a room full of, say, sociologists or psychologists or historians, and you ask them about some issue, the room would be divided on what the importance of the issue was, and so forth. But in the case of trade, especially with economists are like 99% in favor of free trade. But if you got a room full of ordinary people, or especially a room full of politicians, you would find great division about whether trade is a good idea or not. And so the question is, why is that? So those people who think trade is a good idea, they will make cases like this, that trade enhances specialization and specialization is the key to prosperity. That's true. Even people who don't like trade don't disagree with that. Trade increases consumer options. That's also true. But here's the rub. Advocates of trade say that trade increases consumer welfare, and opponents of trade don't think that at all. Opponents of trade think that trade destroys jobs and trade causes unemployment and that trade decreases consumer welfare. So I have a little slide here about how to measure consumer welfare, and if you've never had an upper level econ class, this slide won't be very helpful to you, but I'm going to put it up anyway. So let's see, where'd it go? Here it is. So for those of you who can remember your undergraduate econ days, there was a thing called a production possibilities curve. So this production possibilities curve maps out all the combinations of good A and good B that people in this simple country can consume given their constraints, that is, given their limited amount of land, labor, capital, their limited technology, and so forth. They are constrained by the production possibilities curve. So let's imagine in this simple country that people kind of like good A, maybe 3 times as much as good B. So they don't really want to be here in the middle, which would be equal amounts of A and B. They want to be over here someplace. So this is a preference line that maps out what people in this country like. And because this line is kind of flat, all it says is that people in this country like good A a little better than they like good B. So given they're constrained by the production possibilities curve, they will elect to produce here. They will have this much good A available to them and this much good B. Okay? Now, once you allow trade, it turns out that the terms of trade in the rest of the world can be very different from their preferences. So let's say in the rest of the world that trade looks like this. That is, you can trade good B for good A along this line here. So what would happen is that the people in this country, once you allowed for trade, they would stop producing here and they would instead produce over here. Even though that's a lot more B than what they really want, they would make all this good B and then they would trade it for what they really want along this trade line until they got over here. They would trade to here. I hope you can see that once you allow for trade, the country specializes and then it takes this good that it doesn't really want that much and it trades it for what it truly wants. And I hope you can see that this goal choice here, this amount of good A, is far superior to what they would have had if they didn't trade, and also this amount of good B is far superior than what they would have had if they didn't trade. So economics makes a strong case that trade increases consumer welfare. Alright, so what about this idea of destroying jobs? Does trade destroy jobs? Well, yeah, it does. But a lot of things destroy jobs besides trade. Technological innovation destroys jobs. People change their preferences, that destroys jobs, and on it goes. So we don't think, when Henry Ford applied the concept of the assembly line to the production of automobiles, it put a lot of horse and buggy repair shops out of business, and little stables all over every little town. All those stables, they all went out of business. Nobody suggests that we would be better off if we just made it illegal to have automobiles. So technology destroys jobs just like trade does. So why say, okay, trade destroys jobs, therefore we shouldn't have trade, when we allow other things that destroy jobs all the time? It's really obvious that trade doesn't cause unemployment. All you have to do is look at the unemployment rate through time and you can see it's not related in any way to the trade deficit or trade surplus. But I've drawn a little supply and demand to help make this case. Let's say that here's some domestic product and here's the foreign import in the same country. So this is a competitor for this. Here's the US made product and here's some competitor. They're selling for this price. So every one of these foreign sales represents a sale that the domestic firm didn't get. So let's suppose that the domestic firm gets the attention of the government somehow, and they get the government to agree to put a tax on the foreign import. We call them tariffs, but a tariff is really just a tax on the foreign import. So we put a tax on the foreign import, and that causes the supply curve to shift back to the left as those foreign producers now have to pay this tax. I hope you can see that sales of the foreign product will go down and the price of the foreign product will go up. Well, that's good news if you're the domestic producer, because that means now that the foreign product is more expensive than yours, and so you will get a lot of customers that would have bought the foreign product. So from your perspective, the demand curve will increase for your product as these customers are stolen from where they would have been otherwise, and you get a new equilibrium up here, right? So this is fantastic news for the domestic producer because the price has gone up and sales have gone up, right? Price has gone up, sales have gone up in the domestic market. Prices also gone up in the foreign market, but that's because of the tax. The foreign producer doesn't get that money, and their sales have gone down. But people who think this is a good idea, they don't really care what's happening in the foreign market. They only care about this. So they look at this and they think it's all good. But what they fail to realize is what else happens downstream from this. So let me change this example a little bit to something that you might be familiar with. Instead of calling this a domestic product, let's call it domestic lumber. So it turns out that we produce a lot of lumber in the United States, but so does Canada. And we have at the moment restrictions on Canadian lumber. Did you know it's really difficult for you to buy Canadian lumber to use it to build your house because we have import tariffs on that. So what happens is that because this substitute, this competitor for domestic lumber, has a big tax on it, it causes the demand curve for the domestic lumber to shift out. Well, that's fantastic news if you're a stockholder or the owner of a sawmill in the United States. The demand curve has gone up, the price has gone up, sales have gone up. This is good for you. But what people don't normally think about is, what about the users downstream? So over here, let's let this be home construction. And because lumber is now more expensive than it was before, the supply curve for new homes shifts back to the left because it costs more to produce them now since the lumber is more expensive. Houses get more expensive and fewer houses are made. So what is good for this firm is bad for this firm. Who can say that these workers are more deserving than those? I wouldn't be comfortable ever saying that. It seems to me that consumers should be willing to decide where their hard-earned consumer dollar goes. Okay, so let's see. Where are we now? So let's summarize this. How many trade balance accounts are there? There are 4. Trade is destructive. That's true, it is. But so are other things. Schumpeter, a famous economist that studied these kind of dynamic movements in the economy, is quoted as saying, "The process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one and incessantly creating a new one." In the old days they called it Schumpeter's Gale. Since I've been a student, which was actually quite a few years ago, we called it Schumpeter's creative destruction. But it's this idea that entrepreneurs are constantly looking for new and better ways to do things, and when they are successful, the old ways fall away, or to put it more dramatically, the old ways are destroyed. So I think I collected a few photos to show you. These men, I'm sure you can see, are building looks like a truck, probably in the 1930s, maybe in the 1940s, and they're doing it by hand. What's happened to these jobs? Nobody builds trucks like this anymore. Robots do this work now, right? These jobs are destroyed. They weren't destroyed by trade, they were destroyed by technology. I'm old enough to remember what this guy's doing, but my guess is that most of you don't. This guy works at an ice house, and this is a 300-pound block of ice, and he's moving them with his tongs here. And basically he takes it over to another machine that cuts it up or grinds it up into crushed ice that a fish market might buy, right? None of these jobs exist anymore. Now they're done by vending machines. Have you gone to one of these vending machines that sells 20 pounds of crushed ice now? This is how they used to do it when I was a little child, but now no more. I don't remember this, but this guy is building ships, and what he's done is he's made this curve off the drawings, and he's using this curve to make a model of the ship's hull that will then go out to the yard where the ship is welded up, and they will actually take calipers and measure the dimensions of this model and then transpose that into the dimensions of the ship. None of that works that way nowadays. Now it's done by computer, I think probably with AutoCAD. Alright, so trade allows for specialization. And we talked about this already. Specialization is this idea that all of you are training for. But I do have a famous quote from Adam Smith. Smith says, "This division of labor from which so many advances are derived," he's talking about specialization, "is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion." Now you got to remember that Adam Smith wrote this over 200 years ago, and so the English language has drifted a little, so you have to focus to see what he's really saying, but it's not too hard. It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, that is, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. We do it individually, right? We do it in our communities. We do it from state to state. We don't have any laws that prevent us from buying things, say, from Georgia or North Carolina. So economists would argue that, well, if that arbitrary political boundary between Charleston and North Charleston, Charleston County and Berkeley County, South Carolina and North Carolina, if those boundaries, we shouldn't have trade barriers across those boundaries, why would we have them between the United States and, say, our Canadian neighbor? Anyway, so trade allows for specialization. The more trade you have, the more specialized we can become. Okay, that's it. Hope you found this helpful.